Imagine floating in open ocean, 60 feet above the deepest trench you've ever seen, and knowing, not guessing, knowing, that somewhere beneath you is something bigger than a school bus, with teeth the size of your hand. Now imagine that same ocean, a few million years later, without it at all. Not hunted into extinction by a bigger predator. Not outfought. The largest, most successful shark that ever lived, an animal so dominant it had almost no natural enemies, simply stopped being able to survive in the world it once ruled. Why? For most of the last century, the answer felt obvious. Something must have killed it. A bigger shark. A smarter competitor. Maybe even us, in some Hollywood fantasy where it's still down there. Megalodon was framed as a monster defeated by a rival monster, because that's the story we tell about apex predators. Something always has to be stronger. But that assumption is starting to look almost embarrassingly simple. Because the deeper scientists dig into what actually happened around 3.5 million years ago, the less this looks like a fight Megalodon lost to another animal. It looks like a fight it lost to the ocean itself. For decades, the working theory was straightforward. Megalodon went extinct because something displaced it. Most commonly, the rise of great white sharks, or the arrival of large, intelligent, pod-hunting predators like early orcas. Bigger brains. Better teamwork. A more efficient killer moving into the neighborhood. It's a satisfying story, because it fits a pattern we already believe in. Evolution as an arms race, where the strongest, smartest, most adaptable competitor always wins. It's also, increasingly, looking incomplete. Here's the first problem. When researchers actually mapped out the timeline, using fossil teeth, sediment layers, and ocean temperature records, they found something strange. Megalodon's decline didn't line up neatly with the rise of any single rival predator. It lined up with something far less dramatic and far more unsettling. The ocean's chemistry and temperature were changing beneath its fins, in ways it may never have been built to survive. Around 2.6 million years ago, Earth entered a series of dramatic climate shifts. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Sea levels dropped as water locked into massive polar ice sheets. And that single shift, water leaving the oceans and freezing at the poles, did something devastating to the shallow coastal ecosystems Megalodon depended on. Because here's something most people never consider about the largest predator to ever patrol the seas. It didn't live in the deep ocean at all. Fossil evidence, nursery sites packed with the teeth of juvenile megalodons, suggests it relied heavily on warm, shallow coastal waters to raise its young. Not the open abyss. Not the deep trenches of horror movie imagination. Shallow, warm, coastal nurseries, the kind of water where a young shark could grow strong before facing the real ocean. Which means the true story of Megalodon's extinction might not start with teeth at all. It might start with a map, and watching that map quietly shrink. Picture a young Megalodon, barely the size of an adult great white, patrolling a warm coastal bay somewhere in what's now Panama or the Carolinas. This is its whole world. Everything it needs, food, safety from larger sharks, warm water to keep its massive metabolism running efficiently, exists within a few dozen miles of coastline. Now picture that coastline changing. Not overnight. Across generations. Sea levels dropping as ice ages tighten their grip. Warm shallow bays draining into narrower channels. The nursery grounds its species relied on for millions of years slowly, quietly, disappearing from the map. This is where the science becomes almost eerie in its precision. Researchers studying fossil teeth from Megalodon nursery sites found a measurable decline in average juvenile size right before the species vanished. Not a small statistical wobble, but a signal consistent with young megalodons growing up in worse conditions, with less food, in shrinking nurseries. It's the fossil record equivalent of watching a population run out of room to raise its children. And an animal that struggles to raise its young doesn't need a rival predator to disappear. It just needs time. Here's the twist that changes how you have to think about this animal entirely. We've spent decades imagining Megalodon as the strongest thing in the ocean, untouchable, apex, invincible. But size, in evolution, is almost never free. The same massive body that made Megalodon nearly unkillable also made it enormously expensive to run. Estimates suggest an adult Megalodon may have needed to eat the equivalent of dozens of seals or whales' worth of meat regularly just to sustain itself. That kind of biological engine only works in a very specific kind of world, one overflowing with large energy-rich prey, in warm, productive coastal waters. Take away the warm water. Shrink the coastline. Reduce the density of large marine mammals nearby. And suddenly the very thing that made Megalodon dominant, its size, becomes the exact thing working against it. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you've ever admired Megalodon as the ultimate survivor. Being the strongest, biggest, most feared predator on Earth did not protect it from the one force evolution has never lost to, an environment that stops cooperating. There's a scientific mystery buried in this story that took researchers years to untangle, and it involves something you wouldn't expect: whales. Around the same time Megalodon was declining, the ocean's whale populations were going through their own transformation. Many of the large, slow-moving whale species Megalodon likely preyed on were shrinking in number, partly due to the same climate shifts reshaping coastlines, and partly due to competition from smarter, faster predators entering the scene, including the ancestors of modern orcas and great white sharks. Here's where it gets interesting. Those newer predators weren't necessarily bigger or stronger than Megalodon. In fact, an adult Megalodon could likely have overpowered them individually without much trouble. But they were faster, more efficient, capable of hunting smaller, quicker prey that a heat-hungry, massive-bodied animal like Megalodon simply couldn't chase down as effectively. Which means the real threat to Megalodon may never have been a bigger monster. It may have been a leaner one. Let's slow down here, because this is where the story stops being about sharks and starts being about something far more universal. We tend to imagine extinction as a battle, a clash between rivals, a winner and a loser, claws against teeth. But Megalodon's disappearance suggests something quieter and, frankly, more frightening: that dominance and survival are not the same thing. Being the strongest doesn't mean being the most adaptable. Being the biggest doesn't mean being the most efficient. Megalodon ruled its world so completely that it may never have needed to evolve flexibility, because for millions of years, nothing forced it to. And when the world finally did change, its greatest strength had nowhere to bend. There's a particular fossil discovery that captures this shift almost poetically. Along certain coastal fossil beds, paleontologists have found layers where Megalodon teeth are abundant and then, moving upward through the sediment, gradually become smaller, rarer, and finally vanish altogether, replaced almost seamlessly by the teeth of early great white sharks. Not evidence of a battle. No bite marks. No signs of direct conflict between the two species has ever been confirmed. Just one species fading as the water cooled, and another, smaller, faster, more flexible, quietly filling the space it left behind. That absence of conflict is almost harder to accept than a dramatic battle would be. We want defeat to look like something: a wound, a chase, a final confrontation between predator and predator. What the fossil record suggests instead is something closer to a slow erasure, an animal that simply ran out of the specific conditions it had always depended on, while something more adaptable moved in around its edges. Here's the second twist, and it's the one that should sit with you a little longer than the first. We tend to assume evolution rewards power. Bigger teeth, bigger bodies, more force. It's an easy story, because it flatters our instincts about strength. But Megalodon's extinction points towards something evolution seems to reward far more consistently: flexibility. An animal that can survive on multiple types of prey. An animal that can tolerate a wider range of temperatures. An animal that doesn't need one specific kind of nursery, one specific coastline, one specific abundance of giant prey, in order to raise its young successfully. Those traits rarely make headlines. They don't sell movie posters. But across the fossil record, again and again, they're the traits that outlast raw power when the environment shifts beneath everyone's fins at once. This reframes the entire story of what apex predator actually means. We treat that phrase like a permanent title, as if reaching the top of a food chain is the finish line of evolution. But Megalodon's disappearance suggests the top of the food chain might be one of the most fragile positions an animal can occupy, because it's a position built entirely on the assumption that the current world will keep existing. Let's go deeper into what this might have actually felt like, as much as we can reconstruct it. Imagine being one of the last Megalodons, patrolling waters that no longer held the herds of prey your ancestors relied on. Imagine a body built for abundance, moving through growing scarcity. Not a dramatic death. A long, slow mismatch between what your body needs and what the ocean is willing to provide. There's something almost unbearably human about that image, if you let yourself sit with it. Because we like to imagine collapse as sudden, a single blow, a single villain, a single moment where everything changes. But most collapses, in nature and elsewhere, don't work that way. They work the way Megalodon's decline appears to have worked: a slow tightening of the margins, generation after generation, until a species that once ruled an entire ocean simply couldn't find enough of what it needed to keep existing. This is where the story stops being about ancient sharks entirely. Because every dominant species that has ever existed, predator, empire, ecosystem, idea, has faced some version of the same quiet question Megalodon faced without ever knowing it was being asked. What happens when the specific conditions that made you powerful stop existing? Do you bend? Do you adapt to something smaller, faster, less certain? Or does the very thing that made you great become the reason you can't change fast enough? There's no fossil that can tell us whether Megalodon understood any of this, in any way resembling awareness. It almost certainly didn't. But the pattern its extinction reveals is one we recognize instinctively, because we see versions of it everywhere. In species, in businesses, in civilizations that mistake current dominance for permanent safety. Here's the detail that makes this story stay with you long after the facts fade. Somewhere in the fossil record, there's a final Megalodon tooth, not marked as special in any obvious way, no drama attached to it, but statistically, somewhere among the thousands we found, one of them belonged to one of the last individuals of its kind. That shark didn't die in some cinematic final battle against a bigger predator. It likely died the way most of its ancestors for the previous few generations had, hungry, in a shrinking warm water range, surrounded by an ocean that had quietly stopped being the world it was built for. No rival monster defeated Megalodon. The ocean simply changed its terms, and the greatest predator it had ever produced turned out to be exactly as dependent on those terms as everything else living in it. So the next time someone tells you Megalodon was invincible, that nothing could have beaten it, consider what actually ended it. Not teeth. Not a bigger shark. Not a single dramatic moment. Just an ocean, quietly rewriting its own rules, faster than the strongest thing living in it could learn to bend. And if the most dominant predator the sea has ever known couldn't outpower that kind of change, what makes any of us think dominance is the same thing as safety?